Welcome to Conversations on Sacred Civic Placemaking. I'm so glad that you've set aside this hour for us to engage in this conversation. My conversation partner today is my dear friend and traveling companion, MichaelRay Mathews. I'm going to say more about MichaelRay in just a moment, but a couple of housekeeping things. MichaelRay and I are going to have a conversation here, kind of fishbowl experience for you all. You'll listen in. And then after about 35 minutes, we will open it up to your questions, and we'll ask you to place those questions in the Zoom chat. And so we'll field your questions from there. MichaelRay and I met in 1995 at the American Baptist Seminary of the West in Berkeley. He started his Master of Divinity program a semester before me, but we met that fall of '95. MichaelRay was on the full-time program. I was on the part-time program, so he finished much earlier than I did. But we hit it off from the beginning. Had some classes together, and probably a couple of years into our time there in Berkeley, decided that we wanted to spend some more time together. And we started meeting for breakfast and had some lunches. And we discovered what was behind our mutual attraction. We are the same personality type, INFJ. We're both from Southern California, probably just miles from each other. And found that we were looking at the world in very similar ways. So MichaelRay is a co-founder of Sympara, along with me and two other friends who were with us at the very beginning 18 years ago. He is also the Deputy Director and Chief Faith Officer for Faith in Action, the national faith-rooted community organizing group. MichaelRay got into community organizing while he was the senior pastor of Grace Baptist Church in San Jose, California. And from that involvement, moved into national leadership with what was formerly called PICO, and today is known as Faith in Action. So MichaelRay, my friend, I'm so glad we get to have this conversation today. In some ways, this is an ongoing conversation that you and I've been having for a while as we inhabit these worlds of social activism and social innovation, and as we travel together in the work of Sympara. So I want to jump right into the heart of the matter here to get our conversation going. I live in Wake County, North Carolina, and where I live, organizers are mobilizing congregations around the issue of affordable housing and the need to create better jobs. And the idea that they have is this is a direct quote: by joining together, we can build homes that people can actually afford, create real pathways to better jobs, and ensure that we all benefit from Wake County's dramatic economic transformation. And the actions that this organizing group is taking are all political. So, and there are multiple actions. It's about going to the different municipalities in Wake County and advocating for more budget dollars for affordable housing, for a greater set aside in projects for affordable housing. Political actions are the agenda of this organizing group. Also in Wake County, there are multiple enterprises trying to solve the problem of affordable housing and working to create better jobs. So these are good folks that are organizing and good folks that are creating businesses all toward the same objective. And my sense is that they likely do not know each other. Social activists and social entrepreneurs seem to live in different worlds. And so MichaelRay, I want to first just talk about, why is that? Why does it seem like social activists and social entrepreneurs live in different worlds?
Well, first of all, Dan, thank you so much for the invitation to be in conversation with you today and with everyone else. I would say that from my experience, it has a lot to do with the ways in which we have sort of accidentally on purpose been placed in different worlds, different lanes, and have been told to stay in our lane. Sometimes we actually police ourselves staying in our lanes. Sometimes even staying on our street, like we're not even gonna be on the same street. And so I think that, when I was first exposed to organizing many years ago now, I was taught that organizing was a unique discipline. And that is true. But I was also taught that it is different and distinct from activism. It is different and distinct from community development. It is different and distinct from mobilizing folks. It is different and distinct than what we might see in large movements. And at that time, we were still hearkening back to the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 1960s. And we were told that, that all that stuff is not organizing, and that's not what we do. And so there was a way in which, especially for me as an African American, I would experience these moments where organizers would engage African American congregations, seeking to get those congregations involved in the organizing work. And the pastor of the congregation would say, well, I really want to do a lot of community development. And the organizer would say, well, we don't do that. And that would kind of be the end of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I would be coaching young organizers when I joined the national staff, and they would tell me these kinds of stories. I keep saying, no, don't say that. Don't say we don't do that. Ask the question about what it means to look at where this interest in community development and the need for community organizing come together. Mm. So there's a way in which I think we sort of accidentally on purpose have been positioned in a way where we have a kind of orthodoxy and orthopraxy about these different kinds of approaches to social problems. And we have a way in which a set of relationships puts us in certain camps, ways in which other structures divide us up in this way, like philanthropy in particular. If philanthropy is falling in love with organizing, then if you're doing other things, you might not get the attention of philanthropy. Or you might try to convince philanthropy that what you're doing is also organizing, or what you're doing is also community development. And that kind of puts you also in a competitive position and creates a way in which these disciplines can compete against one another, as opposed to finding ways of being connected to one another and really addressing very complex problems that really can't be addressed by using just one tool.
That's good. Yeah, I want to probe a little further. You mentioned the experience of organizers coming to a Black congregation and saying, we don't do that. We don't do community development. And a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is, do you have an extra item there? Okay. One.
I'm sorry. I lost you on the audio. Not sure why.
Okay. Okay. One is that community development has been a discipline of the Black church for decades. So it's kind of one observation. And that community organizing, at least the major models of community organizing in the United States, were started by white leaders.
Yes.
So your organization was founded by a white Roman Catholic priest. The Gamaliel Foundation, the Industrial Areas Foundation, come out of a we might say a progressive white ethos. So I'm wondering how race plays here in these kind of different approaches.
Yes, well, it's important to know that in most of the scenarios where organizers are talking to pastors about how community development is like not what we do, and therefore there's nothing to talk about, or maybe a longer conversation where I'm trying to convince you that what I do in organizing is better than what you're saying you want to do with community development. Those historically have been conversations between white organizers and Black pastors. And even when the conversation has been with Black organizers and Black pastors, the Black organizers are often the ones who were hired, especially back when I first got involved. They were hired to, make inroads with Black pastors that the white organization, the white director, the white organizer was not able to engage. But they're still asked to offer the same medicine to these Black pastors. Mm-hmm. So I'm still offering, the medicine that comes from an imagination that can't really see all of you in it. Mm-hmm. One of the things I teach in my training is that if we're not cultivating a moral imagination together, we are then probably living inside someone else's. Mm. And I think the real challenge for organizing over the past 25 years that I've been connected to this work has been for us to expand our imagination, to cultivate an imagination that brings in the experiences and perspectives and needs of a diversity of people over time. Many folks who are familiar with organizing and familiar particularly with the stories of the networks that you just outlined a minute ago, their understanding and definition of organizing begins with the work of Saul Alinsky. Mm-hmm. And there have been many, many times where I have been walking around the world minding my own business and have been told that you're an Alinsky organizer. And I remember early on, I was like, I'm sorry, I don't know Mr. Alinsky. So I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. And then, of course, these are folks who've read books. Yeah. And they're very learned, and so they want to tell me something and help me understand how I am an Alinsky organizer. Mm-hmm. This is once again a racialized conversation with white people telling me who I am. Yeah. And so that doesn't go very far, but but over time, I realized like there is such a dominant understanding of what organizing is that's shaped by this, and of course, a lot of the political antics that were a part of our experience during the election of 2008 and during the Obama presidency were also shaped by the fact that he was a community organizer. And so then that became a politicized, discipline. And so there were ways in which more people knew about Saul Alinsky all of a sudden because you had to go back and study and do a whole piece on how evil Saul Alinsky's work is. Oh, yes. And therefore, right. And so and like, even when that was happening, there was I had a small impulse to want to defend what I was growing to understand about Saul Alinsky, combined with my, pretty clear stance that I don't know Mr. Alinsky. So I don't have to account or, defend him or defend his work. I have to be clear about the organizing tradition that informs me. And it may be organizing that comes from the good folks in Faith in Action, formerly PICO. Yep. It may come from the imagination of my dear brother, Father John Bauman, our founder. but it also comes from my great-grandmother, Essie Lou Elliott Jester. And it comes from a whole host of elders and ancestors who have been organizing on the soil of what we call the United States for several centuries. And so what does it mean for me to be drawing from that tradition as well? And what does it mean for us all to be drawing from that tradition and from many other traditions that inform the organizing work?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, when I observe the religious landscape, I notice that for some religious leaders, it's an exercise of their agency or their power to preach for economic justice or for racial equity, while other leaders might ask, do you see where you're preaching? You know, do you see where that pulpit is located, the property that you stand upon? Do something with it. So I wonder, is there a different understanding of agency or power in these two fields of organizing and social innovation?
Yes, I think there is. Sometimes, I know for me, just being transparent, like early on when I was first being introduced to organizing, and I was also learning about community development here and there, I knew less about community development than I did about organizing. And community development seemed like it was about business and about being able to understand the economy. And, you know, there are a lot of ways that we do theologies in churches that, you know, make us very afraid of talking about money, make us very afraid about talking about the economy and how economic systems work, make us very afraid of thinking about what it means to be engaged in an economic practice. Mm-hmm. The only economic practice we preach is, you know, tithes and offerings. Right. So, you know, so I think sometimes our imaginations about our even our theological imaginations about the economy and the resource of money itself can sometimes get in the way of our capacity to imagine how community development or being a social entrepreneur is actually a theologically sound way of walking into the world and living out your sense of vocation. And I think the same is true for organizing. Organizing is often seen as a confrontational, in-your-face, political endeavor that, you know, is always agitating and making enemies of other people. And so people will say, I don't want to do organizing because you guys are in people's faces all the time and it's too political. And so those are two things that, you know, I think Christians in particular in traditional church settings, we're kind of discipled away from that kind of thinking. And so I do think that there are different ways that we imagine power and imagine agency. It gets to this point, like what imaginary are we living inside? And are we involved in a very robust cultivation of a moral imagination that is examining from a pretty holistic standpoint all of the various ways in which our lives are contexted. Mm-hmm. When I teach about race, I talk about how racism operates at the intrapersonal level, like it's about what's going on inside of us, implicit and explicit biases that shape how we see the world and see other people around us. It's also about interpersonal work, like what happens between people, what relationships we have and don't have, and the quality of those relationships. Much of our debate about race kind of stays in those realms where we try to convince people that we are not racist individually, or that we don't have a racist bone in our body, even though racism is actually a bone deep reality. Because it's deep in the bones of who we are and deep in the bones of not just us as human beings individually and collectively, but we also have to look at the two other levels at which racism operates, which is institutional and structural as well as cultural.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like our work about living faithfully into our call as people of faith and moral courage is about doing work at multiple levels.
Yeah.
And once we start trying to think about what it means to do work at multiple levels, then we have to imagine what it means to engage in the confluence of multiple disciplines, multiple practices, multiple kinds of ideas and approaches to how we address social problems in our world.
It strikes me that that the African American tradition, religious tradition, or traditions have been working at those multiple levels for decades. We've in seminary, in Dr. Cummings' class on Malcolm and Martin, we read Taylor Branch's story of the King years, and I remember that's the story of Dr. King's predecessor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Dr. Vernon Johns,
Yes.
who would preach and then leave the sanctuary and take off his robes and go stand in the back of a truck with a bunch of produce and sell the produce from the farm. And his
That's right.
the members of his church were mortified because they didn't think the preacher should be doing this. But he
Right.
was, long before the language of social innovation or social entrepreneurship became part of our vernacular, he was doing it. And then there were others.
Yeah.
Our preaching professor, Dr. J. Alfred Smith, one of the nation's foremost preachers, created the Allen Temple Community Development Corporation in Oakland.
That's right.
And that corporation, an entrepreneurial endeavor, has to date, I think, created 3 or 4 housing communities along with other projects. And that was in the early 80s. A decade before that, in Oakland, the Black Panthers were organizing, and they were also creating enterprises, bakeries and schools, and other ways of, other kind of forms of alternative economy, Black-owned enterprise. So maybe, we really are talking about kind of a racialized difference here in perspective and approach. And I know that your organization, and I assume Gamaliel and Industrial Areas Foundation, that they're evolving, as new leadership comes into these organizations and brings with them the experience of working at multiple levels. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I think the Black tradition around social change is quite complex. Like, there are just multiple levels at which folks are acting in concert in communities to improve communities. People are drawing from wisdom, good folk wisdom about how to make things work. People were being creative. They didn't have these ways of dividing up their lives. Their lives were whole, and so all of these things fit together. Both, getting on the back of your truck and selling your produce, as well as preaching, God's word in the pulpit. They're all connected to one.
Mm-hmm.
I saw the comment in the chat about a lot of bivocational African American clergy. I think that's also a big part of that reality as well. Is that you always are trying to figure out how your whole life makes sense and not compartmentalize your life into different pieces. I will say that at its best, what your opening statement about the Black church tradition is true. But I would also say that there are places where the Black church has been influenced by this more compartmentalized way of thinking about the world. And so sometimes even those of us who come out of Black church tradition sometimes have to refresh ourselves and remind ourselves of just the vast open space in which we can be the creative people that we were called to be in the world as co-creators with the Holy One. Mm-hmm. So I want to say that it's not like a universal experience that we're we're all in the Black church tradition, operate in this way. But if we want to draw from the best of our traditions, that would be the example that you've described, I would say. That would be an example to draw from.
Yeah, no, that's good. You use the word creative and co-creators. So I've got to ask you, when I observe faith-rooted community organizing, I think of it in terms of one half of the prophetic way. So it's the critical aspect of the prophetic tradition. It's speaking truth to power. It's calling things to account, calling leaders to account, calling systems to account. It's that critical analysis. There's also this creative dimension. We know in the prophetic tradition that there's this summons to plant vineyards and to restore streets, to seek the health of the city, which to me sounds like creative endeavors. And so how does creativity, being co-creators, how are you seeing that show up in the organizing world?
Well, I think that, at least in my experience in the past, 15 years, 20 years, there's been so much creativity that has become a part of the organizing practice as we find ourselves more engaged with a broader set of folks. So, as our capacity to engage African-American congregations and communities began to improve, it also meant that we were now cultivating a moral imagination with a much wider and diverse set of folks. And so we had to think differently about how we do some of our work. There are times where our organizing not only results in an innovative policy solution, which is the typical product of organizing, is some kind of a policy solution, but it's also spawned services like direct service organizations, or it may have spawned, in some cases, some business ventures, and create a capacity for people in communities to start businesses. And so there are ways in which more creative thinking has allowed for us to imagine these things. I think that the Ferguson moment, the Black Lives Matter moment, has also been a significant catalyst for this kind of thinking. In the broader movement, folks are talking about not just organizing and not just being entrepreneurs, and not just being artists, and not just being community developers, and not just being activists and mobilizing people in the streets, and not just being culture makers. They're talking about all of these things at the same time, and they're creating pathways to do this. And this is happening primarily among a younger set of leaders in the movement that we are experiencing in this moment. And that's because people are drawing from an imagination that's not so tightly defined by our theologies and by the work of the church. They are making this happen, in the streets. And so they're drawing from the creative experiences that they're already having out in the world, which I think is another reason why creativity can't come from just the preaching side of the work. In fact, your preaching will get better if you actually are creating. Your preaching will get better if you are actually in relationships and in real experiences in the world. And not only will your preaching get better, but the experience of the congregation together will grow and change as well. If congregations together are engaged in this kind of creative work in the world, the whole congregation's imagination about who it is and what it can be doing in the world, the preaching moment becomes something different. It's not just my liberal pastor up there saying the stuff they always say when something happens in the world, but we've been out in the world together and are drawing from that experience to contemplate what our call is and to celebrate the movement of the Spirit and to call ourselves to be even greater in the kind of work that we lead in the world.
We're as a nation, we're starting to inch our way to the edge of a national conversation about reparations. Mm-hmm. And so we can anticipate there will be organizing around this. In fact, it's already occurring at local and state and national levels. And we can also observe that in localities, congregations are starting to have, conversations about what reparations might mean for them, for their community. Mm-hmm. And some are even going so far to make the connection to their property, their assets, and looking at the history of how they came to own that asset, or how that church was built, by whom. It seems that here, sacred civic placemaking, particularly around this critical issue of reparations and racial equity, may be the opportunity to bring these two worlds together, the world of the organizer and the world of the entrepreneur or innovator. What's your take on that, MichaelRay?
Oh, indeed. I mean, I think reparations is a multifaceted conversation. Mm-hmm. It's not just. I remember when I was first exposed to it as a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s. It was about a check being written to the descendants of folks who had been enslaved. And I now, am very clear that, reparations is more of a process and more of an experience. And it's also not something that happens on one side. The repair is happening mutually. Mm-hmm. And so I think once again, as I mentioned before, this holistic, expansive way of thinking about the work of social change, that kind of holistic and expansive thinking and imagination has to be a part of how we think about reparations. And there are all kinds of ways that we can engage in reparations, small and large, and that we have to have the capacity to zoom in and to zoom out, to zoom into the particularities of what's happening at the corner of any set of streets in that place, zoom out to understand how that corner is connected to a larger community and a larger world, zoom out even further to look at how that land and how the people who've inhabited that land are part of a long history as well. And once you begin to engage that kind of an analysis, that kind of appreciation of the story of a place and the story of a people, your capacity to imagine ways to repair streets, to raise up foundations, your capacity to imagine that deepens and grows alongside it. I think this is a wonderful time for folks who live in the sometimes too strictly defined worlds of placemaking and organizing, to be not just in relationship or conversation rather with each other, but in relationship, mm-hmm. in deep relationship, mm-hmm. where some of this study, some of this zooming in and zooming out is happening mm-hmm. For people collectively at the same time, where we really are cultivating that moral imagination that I was talking about before. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I've taken note from your optimistic outlook here on a more holistic approach. Some of our sacred civic placemaking for Sympara is happening where you live in San Jose in the Silicon Valley. And when we started there 18 months ago, um, uh, it was very difficult to get a hearing with some congregations. I'm speaking specifically of kind of white progressive congregations who own a lot of property, and some of those properties have huge parking lots that that could be repurposed for affordable housing. But as you dig in more, I learned that a number of those congregations were part of faith-rooted organizing around affordable housing. And so there was already something in the mix there that was moving them maybe toward a more holistic approach. They hadn't yet come to the question, what can we do with our own property? Or, to use that ancient text around Moses's calling, what's that in your hand? What do you already have that you can leverage? But I was encouraged just a couple of weeks ago to learn that a group of these congregations that are part of your Faith and Actions affiliate there are now coming to the city council and advocating not just for more funding, which would be the kind of the traditional agenda, but for permission to host temporary shelter in their parking lots, because they're recognizing, what's that in your hand? We got a huge parking lot, and people in the South Bay are living in their cars, and they can't really, it's not realistic for them to go into shelters where you have to pack up every morning and take your stuff, leave at 6 a.m. in the morning, and then you can come back at night. That's just not realistic for a growing number of people who are sleeping in their cars on the street and going off to jobs, or maybe multiple jobs during the day. So there is a shift that's happening. Those congregations are starting to realize we have something. We have an asset that we can use to solve this problem. So I think that's a sign of the holism that or the holistic approach that you're pointing to, which I hear is kind of aspirational. But here and there, we are beginning to see evidence of that, which is encouraging. And I think it comes together here in this work of sacred civic placemaking, where we both proclaim and we also practice. I want to.
Can I just say something real quick to that point?
Definitely. Yeah. But to everybody, we're going to shift in just a moment to your questions. So please use the chat to ask whatever questions you have, and then we'll field those one by one. But go ahead, MichaelRay.
I just wanted to say that the issue of affordable housing has been a long journey, particularly in the Bay Area organization that you're talking about, and they really are at the forefront of that kind of organizing in our larger network. I think issues of housing, organizing around housing, are still incredibly too new. And the knowledge around it for many of our organizations is still, pretty shallow. Like, we haven't quite figured out. It seems like such a overwhelming problem to address. And I think we're only just beginning to dig deep, and really that particular organization, Faith and Action Bay Area, is really at the forefront of that. So I'm not surprised to hear that story coming out of that space at all, but it points to the ways in which it's going to take not only our capacity to think through multiple lenses about this, but to actually be in multiple kinds of relationships over time to do this work well. People change in the context of deep relationships and profound encounters. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's the journey of formation for people who are seeing the connections of things like organizing and sacred placemaking. What do we need to actually cultivate, agitate, create, instigate together that informs the imagination and that forms the leadership of those who will champion issues, complicated issues like housing and affordable housing in a place like Silicon Valley, where there's so much wealth, and there's such an overriding sense that we live in a wealthy community that we are often unable to see the folks who live on the other side of that wealth.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think part of complicating the conversation, as you said, is about remembering our history. So whether that's the history of Dr. Vernon Johns or the Black Panthers doing social enterprise in Oakland, or Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr. creating the Allen Temple Community Development Corporation, it's remembering our history, telling the story in a way that has relevance for today. There's other history that we seem that religious communities are disconnected from. In the Bay Area, just to use the example of affordable housing, the groups that are working on building affordable housing are largely faith-rooted. They were started by agencies, related to the United Church of Christ, American Baptist, ecumenical alliances. So in the Bay Area, that's groups like Human Good and Christian Church Homes and Evangelical Association of Housing. And they're building, there was a comment in the chat here about housing for seniors on church properties. Well, these groups are actually building multifamily housing in addition to senior housing, supportive housing for people who have been experiencing homelessness. So we're seeing more and more models of that. But those groups, those innovative groups, are not really well known to progressive congregations who might be part of organizing efforts. So we've got, like you said, we've got to be talking to each other. We got to be meeting each other somehow.
And we got to be building relationships. And we got to, and we have to be learning together. This is what I mean by the formation agenda. Like, we have to be learning together. It's when we have these experiences together. It's when folks find themselves at the same rally or vigil. Is when they find themselves engaging in the stories of actual people who need both, sacred placemaking, affordable housing, really good organizing, community development, who need direct services. For all those people who are in the same space, getting to know each other, understanding how their stories are connected, how these disciplines have been accidentally but on purpose separated from each other. Yeah. It's when we start building relationships of trust and having these profound encounters that shape how we begin to reimagine the world around us that kind of change happens. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I had a conversation yesterday with a leader that well, John Vaughn, the executive pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Yes. Speaking of Dr. King. And I asked him this question about these different worlds that it seems that organizers and innovators live in. And his take on this was that there's oftentimes deep suspicion of these worlds. And I was thinking through that after he shared that with me, and I was thinking, and you can tell me if this is correct, but from the organizing world, which again is even though its leadership is changing, is still comes out of a kind of white progressive movement. looks at the business and enterprise pieces as kind of getting your hands dirty in capitalism. And for white progressive congregations that are, that have all that kind of privilege and they've already accumulated their wealth, it's very easy for them to say, don't do that. That's not good. We can tell you, we've already accumulated our wealth. We can tell you it doesn't satisfy all our needs. So don't even go down that path. And so there's this kind of distancing from that work of enterprise creation and engagement in the marketplace. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I mean, I think it gets to the point I was lifting up early on about the fear sometimes that we have of engaging in, conversations about the economy and conversations about politics. Both of those are barriers for engaging in organizing and for engaging in, the kind of social entrepreneurism that you're talking about. So, I mean, I think that we need very much for folks to be able to reimagine just and prophetic ways that we engage the economy, that we engage the political world. It's time for a whole rethinking. And, it's not until you're in relationships with people whose backs are against the wall that you are forced to confront the barriers in your own thinking. About what's possible and about what might be necessary. The further we are away from a problem, the more we can philosophize about it. That's a principle we teach in organizing. Even though sometimes those of us who organize are pretty far away from the problems that we're talking about in organizing around.
That's good. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions here in the chat. And so I'll just pick up the first one. Does a congregation have to die before they can do innovative, creative things? I would say certainly not. MichaelRay, how would you respond to that?
Yeah. Well,
or maybe they need to die. There's a different kinds of death, right?
Sure. So I mean, I guess I have three answers, and I think the first answer could be the one where I think you're going now, which is like we have to die to some ways of thinking, right? Some ways of understanding ourselves, in order to be able to embrace some of this. And I think there's evidence out there that there are a lot of congregations that are engaged in this innovative kind of work or are trying to lean into it, are doing it because they are dying or are dead. And so, that the question is even asked, to me comes from a place where we see that some of the most creative thinking comes at the point where the church is at its most vulnerable or maybe already gone. I was in Houston a couple of weeks ago at St. John's Church downtown, and that was a church that was a mega church, and it's now seen its numbers fall, but the creativity of his ministry has only flourished more and more and more. A lot of it has been about how they steward the property to create opportunities for housing and economic development in that community, but also ways in which they stand in solidarity with people. Initially, it was them sending solidarity to people who were living with AIDS. There are ways in which the imagination grows when you don't have anything left to fight for. I guess I would certainly want to say that I hope that not every congregation has to die in order for this kind of creativity to emerge. But I do think that the so-called dying of the church, or just the change in the broader religious and spiritual landscape, requires that's a disruption that requires that we create some spaces to reimagine who we are.
Yeah, and that
period on a whole bunch of levels.
Yes, definitely so. So the spiritual death, a letting go for sure is part of that process. I think of the Church of the Resurrection in Alexandria, Virginia. I hosted one of their lay leaders a couple of months on Conversations for Sacred Civic Placemaking. Kat Turner is her name. And she told the story of that church facing the prospect of their death, their literal death in a few years, and also up against a kind of spiritual malaise, a kind of spiritual death. And instead of denying it and putting off that inevitable, they embraced it and ended up tearing down their church to build 113 units of affordable housing for families in that very gentrified area of Northern Virginia. And in the process, they discovered new life. They built a smaller sanctuary next to the affordable housing community. I like to say, they right-sized it for a smaller yet bolder community. And now they're like, what's next? They've got energy. Yeah. It's been catalytic for them, and they've lived in, she says they've lived into their name, Church of the Resurrection.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's fantastic. A question from Reed Trulson: how does a church that is considering repurposing their property into affordable housing for low-income families identify the persons or entities who could be meaningfully invited into conversation? Oh, this sounds like a perfect setup for a one-on-one, MichaelRay.
Yeah, indeed. And, and it's not just a one-on-one, right? It's like a whole series of conversations, and not all of them necessarily one-on-one.
Yeah.
I've doing a lot of rereading of a book called "I've Got the Light of Freedom," organizing in the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And Charles Payne is writing about the networks and relationships and organizing that was happening in the 30s and 40s that sort of set up what we now call, civil rights movement from, the mid 1950s through, the early 70s. And he was making it very clear, like people really understood themselves to be long-term, long-haul social change folks, and that they would have to cultivate meaningful, authentic, organic relationships. There's a chapter he calls "Slow, Respectful Organizing." Mm-hmm. We often are hoping that if we, have the right communications plan, and that's not a knock on your work, Daniel, in Signal Hill. If we have, the most perfect, one-on-one conversation, that we will convert and, folks into this work. I think we have to think in a much more long-term way about the kind of relationships we need to have, the kind of trust we have to build, but also in some pretty creative ways. About how we nurture these relationships over time and see ourselves as being engaged in long-term work together.
Yes. I would add to that in response to Reed's question that in addition to applying the lens, which is oftentimes an organizing lens of the problem that we're trying to solve and how we're going to organize power to address that problem, that we also pick up the lens of assets, the strengths that are already in that neighborhood, in that community. Roughly. That needs to be part of the conversation as well, because who knows what we're going to discover out of that in terms of the assets that are already present and how those assets could be leveraged. There's another community not far from that Alexandria one in Arlington, where they also tore down their sanctuary to create affordable housing, and a multi-story building has been built in its place. And on the ground floor, there's space for social enterprises, including enterprises that are coming from the assets, the strengths, the giftedness of the neighbors. So there's like there's a restaurant called La Cucina that provides workforce development training, living wages, but it's, its leadership is coming out of that community. So bringing that strength or asset-based lens to the conversation I think is really important as well. Yeah, we've got time for probably for one more question. I'm just looking through the comments here. There's some good comments in here. Kind of, I love seeing the back and forth between folks in response to some of the remarks. MichaelRay, we're talking about the need here to develop relationships between these two worlds. You and I have a deep relationship that goes back 25 years now. How can we foster more of this? How can we foster more of this kind of relationship building across these disciplines or sectors?
Well, I think you're modeling it even right now, like creating a space where we're having this kind of conversation, and not just with each other. Because I have to be honest, like there are ways in which, I've admired and watched your work in that world for a long time. And I intuited from the beginning that there's a connection between the work that I'm a part of and the work that you are a part of. And it's only really been in the past year that I've had to really take seriously what it would mean for the two of us to collaborate from the places of giftedness that we both have. So there's also the reality of like deep intention and taking some real steps. Yes. And it's not just the work. It's not just, because, I mean, I don't know how many, primer and vocabulary conversations you and I have had in recent months. Okay, now remind me of what you mean when you say this. And you're like, MichaelRay, I've been talking about this for years with you. I was like, I know. It's that thing you do, and it's great. So tell me what it is again. And so, like, what does it mean for us to take this beyond the conversation between two friends, and bring it into a space like this, and take it beyond this space, and into other spaces, so that there's almost a kind of movement, if you will, where there are a lot of folks having these kinds of conversations together and really nourishing each other's imaginations in that space.
Yeah, that's so well said. Thank you. Thank you to my brother MichaelRay for being in conversation with me today. Thank you all for being part of this, for listening in, and for asking your questions and sharing your comments. We haven't scheduled the next conversations on sacred civic placemaking, but it will be posted to our website, sympara.org, in the next few weeks. So just click through the projects area and you'll be taken to that page on conversations on sacred civic placemaking. We record all of these conversations, so you can go back and watch previous conversations on our YouTube channel. This conversation will also be posted up to our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So please share it with others. Maybe that's another way we can begin to foster this kind of dialogue between these two worlds that have so much in common and share so much of the same desire for a different kind of world we want to create together. So with that, thank you, MichaelRay. Thank you all. Blessings on your good work wherever you are engaged and wherever you are creating sacred civic community. Be well.
Thank you, friend.
All right. Bye-bye.